So I have decided I've changed my mind. It's allowed, you know. It's not always a sign of weakness. It could potentially be a sign of strength. So I am going to stand in this election. I'll be launching my candidacy at midday tomorrow in the Essex seaside town of Clacton. So midday tomorrow, Clacton, at the end of the pier. But perhaps more important than that, so I'm coming back as leader of Reform UK, but not just for this election campaign. I'm coming back for the next 5 years.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots. I'm James Heale. I'm joined today by Katy and Fraser Nelson. Now today, Katy, it's been something of Rishi Sunak's nightmare day. First of all, we had the news that Nigel Farage was making his shock comeback return. He's standing in Clacton and coming back as Reform leader. And then about an hour later, we had this news of this disastrous MRP poll for the Tories. Tell us more about both.
Yeah, so I think, of course, we had Nigel Farage initially say when the election was first called, that he was not going to be making a return to frontline politics. He was not standing for re-election. He said that he blamed the Tories for calling an election when they did. How dare they get in his way? Had he had time, he would have done it for the autumn. And he also said, you know, his main interest lay in America. Now, since he said that, I think there is some frustration from the Reform side that the comments actually went too far and were pretty unhelpful to their campaign. Today, we got the news first thing that there was going to be a surprise announcement from Nigel Farage. Then we had the announcement just an hour ago. And I think by that point, speculation had built up. But effectively, Nigel Farage said that he is returning. He's going to stand in Clacton. And he also is taking over the leadership, so Richard Tice move aside. Now, you almost got the sense in the press conference, which I know you were at, Richard Tice almost had relief. I think he seemed quite pleased, despite lots of questions on it. But if we take a step back, effectively, this is a bit of a disaster for the Tory party. Because I think the only good thing we could have said after the first week of gaffes, torrential rain, problems, was that perhaps the Reform gamble of going early, which they somehow seem to think might, stop Farage, that had worked, and therefore these horror scenarios Tory MPs had worried about of the Conservatives being overtaken by Reform in the polls were not going to come to fruition. Now, there are clearly some holes in terms of what Nigel Farage was saying. A week or so ago, he was saying that 6 weeks was not enough time to stand for Parliament. He's obviously decided 4 weeks is enough time. But the message he had in that press conference was, having gone to a few events with Reform, he felt that voters really wanted him to come back. He felt he had a duty to, and he committed to leading the Reform Party for 5 years. So it is a significant change of events, and I think it's one that's going to really spook Tory MPs. And I know we'll come onto the MRP poll in a bit, but I think, we've had lots of different polls in recent days. We had an electoral calculus one on Friday, which I think suggested the Tories would have 68 MPs. That wasn't such a problem for the Tories because few believed it was so bad. I think the 140 figure is just going to spook MPs because they hope to be making some inroads at this point. But more than that, you combine it with Nigel Farage, and I think the fear will be that it could go down from there rather than up.
Fraser, how will the entry of Nigel Farage as a candidate 4 days before the Electoral Commission deadline and his return as leader really change the tenor of this debate, and what will it mean for the Conservatives' prospects?
Well, in the last few weeks, when you were discussing the prospects of a general election, there'd always be two scenarios. One is a scenario where there's an election in the autumn or in the summer or whenever, where things are pretty bad for the Conservatives. But it was always mentioned, if Farage comes back, all bets are off. It goes from very bad to being a lot worse. Simply because Farage can electrify campaigns. He is one of the most successful and established political entrepreneurs in Britain. He created the Brexit Party out of nothing, went to number one in the European Parliament elections 5 years ago. He pretty much created Ukip. If it wasn't for him, there probably wouldn't have been Brexit. So he has got the ability to change the political weather. We've seen this time and time again. Now, Richard Tice is good organisationally, but of course he's nowhere near as good with the crowds as Farage is. And it seemed the Tories were quite relieved when they heard that Farage is going off to America. How incredibly vain of him, sitting back in GB News saying that the prospect of averting World War III was more important than whatever we mortals might be doing in Britain. So that was the only single piece of good news I think the Conservatives had. Now he's coming back, all bets are off. Now, this isn't to say that Reform are going to double in popularity and overtake the Conservatives is just to say that a wild card has just been played. And nobody's quite sure how this is done. The pollsters think it could be quite significant, but I'm not aware that any of them have actually done a scenario. How would you vote if Nigel Farage was in charge of Reform? Because right now, Reform has been relatively successful, 12% in the polls, broadly speaking. And that's from the mild-mannered Richard Tice, who probably has got no name recognition amongst most of his target voters. But Farage, he's one of the most recognised politicians in Britain. So he has got the ability to market the Reform brand. The question is, can he do it in basically 4 and a bit weeks, which is all he's got left? So it's not, and after having done his chicken run to America, then sort of halted himself at Gatwick Airport and then come all the way back to Westminster. So I think the delayed effect of this means it could be some time before the effect is properly contained by opinion polls. He said in his press conference, James, that you were at, that at the end, basically don't blame me for helping Labour because the last time around I took more votes from Labour than I did from Conservatives. Well, I don't know of many Conservative MPs who think that they're going to be the net beneficiaries of Reform returning to the fold. I think this will split the right even more than it has done. I'm not sure if he's going to win in Clacton. That was Douglas Carswell's seat, of course, one of the few seats that Ukip successfully won as a party. So he's got a reasonable chance there if he's got a chance anywhere. But there aren't going to be that. I mean, but also significant that he says he's back for 5 years leading Reform. Now, I'm not quite sure if we can take him at his word, given he told us he's going to America a few days ago. But if he is back for 5 years, that would mean that he thinks that Reform is here to stay and that Reform will spend the next Parliament anyway, building itself up, perhaps like the Canadian Reform movement did, with a view to perhaps doing a reverse takeover of the Conservatives.
I mean, he also said that he didn't really want to spend every Friday in Clacton. And now, of course, he's having a slightly different view on that. But I think it also poses an interesting question for within the Tory party, because one of the big debates amongst Tory MPs is what is the approach to Nigel Farage. He said he wants to destroy the Conservative Party, but he also wants to change the Conservative Party. You had Kemi Badenoch today on her media round ask a question that I think all potential Tory leadership successors are asked, which is, would you welcome Nigel Farage into the Tory party? And she had quite an interesting answer because it was different to Jacob Rees-Mogg, different to Liz Truss. She said, he's an impressive figure for many reasons, but if you say your mission is to destroy the Conservative Party, perhaps we should take a breath and think before we say come and join our party, which is potentially going to be a dividing line in a Tory election. But also I think if you look at the first few weeks of this Tory campaign, there's been a very much a core vote strategy to try and get those elderly voters back, and a lot of those are Reform voters. Now, Nigel Farage was saying in that press conference that he thinks that there's going to almost be a youthquake of Reform, and Reform on TikTok have the highest following. Nigel Farage himself has a very big personal following on TikTok. So I think they think the polls are not picking up something amongst younger voters. But I think we can say from the Tory campaign strategy, lots of these policies, mandatory national service, offers to pensioners, have been about trying to squeeze the Reform vote. So to have this happen a couple of weeks into that strategy is clearly very far from ideal. James, can you tell us about the energy at the event? How was it? Was there Nigel mania already?
I think it's certainly the building signs of it. Perhaps there's always a sense of expectation with him in the room, and I think what was striking was when Richard Tice first spoke. It was a bit like, "Come on, we're here for the big moment," and then he got up and spoke.
Dragged it out.
Yeah, dragged it out.
Is his last words as party leader?
Absolutely, taking away, sort of dragged off stage, and then it was Nigel's turn. He came back as leader, and we thought, okay, well, he's basically been the leader in all but name for the past 4 years, and then it was the moment he said, standing for Clacton, which was, of course, the only seat that Ukip ever won at a general election. So I think that, there's some polling out commissioned by Aaron Banks in January. It's clearly been on his mind for a while, which shows that he could finish 10 points ahead of Giles Watling, the incumbent Tory MP there. So I think that there is a sense perhaps that, Nigel's back, and this time, he clearly thinks that he can actually finally, at the 8th attempt, get into Parliament.
It's funny, but I wonder, would the residents of Clacton want to... Douglas Carswell was a local MP. He stood in Ukip as somebody who basically genuinely was committed to the constituency. As you say, Katy, Nigel Farage isn't going to want to show his face there after he wins.
He also has said he wants to spend a lot of time in the US, so it is quite... I think the personality of Nigel Farage is such that he clearly, and this is why it's been the nightmare scenario of Tories for some time, he can clearly create some buzz. And one of the things he said was he'd been bored by the election campaign so far, so why not spice things up? And he has. But you do begin to wonder if some of these things, such as, previous comments 2 weeks ago about your real intentions being in the US, might come back to slightly make some of the local residents think twice.
In the space of a week, he's gone from saying he wants to save America to saying he wants to save Clacton.
Yeah.
Now, one of those two things is true.
And I think he also likes to sort of remain above the fray. He's never really been a policy person. He doesn't really like the minutiae of either UKIP or the Reform Party. He likes the big brush stuff. He likes to float around. And so, actually, as you say, were you going out door knocking hour after hour? Probably not.
Yeah, and I think, did the TV debates play a role in this decision? Because one of the factors was there was concern. I think, you had figures like Richard Tice almost suggesting Nigel Farage should be the one to lead the debates. Yeah. But then they hit the problem with the broadcasters that given he did not have he was not the leader, even if he was an honorary member, and he also wasn't running for election, could he get into that 7-way debate on Friday? Now there clearly seems to be a path. I think the BBC would be in trouble or criticised if they tried to stop it. So I think you can also look at this in the sense it's clearly a very, very difficult situation for the Tories, but it also suggests that the Reform Party's campaign in the first couple of weeks has not been going to plan, and they think they need something to really kind of rev it up and bring that challenge to the Tories.
I noticed that Penny Mordaunt has been chosen by the Tories for that 7-person debate on Friday. Now, I'm not sure that she's the best person to put up against Nigel Farage. Personally, I put Kemi Badenoch up there. You won't have one sort of street fighter against another. But I do also wonder if Badenoch and others like her, who seem to be potential leaders of the next Tory, are being kept out of the campaign right now. If there is a sort of strategy in Tory HQ to think, okay, we know that a lot of people are expecting us to lose and are expecting to be leader, so let's keep them out of the picture and let's put in, I don't know, Mel Stride, Claire Coutinho, other slightly more loyal figures. But they might have to change their strategy now that Farage is back and has certainly opened up a new front.
And now, Katy, with the poll that came out today as well, 140 seats for the Tories, worse than 1906, their worst ever result in the Democratic era. What do you think the reaction is going to be among the Conservatives to this?
Well, I think what's quite interesting, given our conversation just now, is Penny Mordaunt is currently predicted to lose her seat. So you have a situation whereby the spokesperson for the Friday debate is going to be someone who, on current polling, is not keeping it, and therefore perhaps has even more of an incentive than anyone else to try and turn things around through her appearance. But I think, you look at it, and I think what's quite worrying for the Tories is where Labour are making inroads is effectively all across the UK. The SNP would go to being the second largest party in Scotland. Scottish Labour would become the largest. You look at, the Northwest, Northeast, Labour really look as though they could be the largest party in those areas too. And then also the Liberal Democrats, which, they get less attention, but in a way have a completely opposite strategy to Reform, where Reform gets similar voting intention shares to Lib Dems, but yet are currently projected to get 0 seats. Now, of course, this is pre-Farage's return, whereas the Liberal Democrats are predicted to get 48 seats, which would be a huge boost for them. And on that, Jeremy Hunt is currently losing his seat to the Liberal Democrats. So I think what this poll, combined with Nigel Farage will do is just further spook Tory MPs who didn't really want this election called in the summer in the first place, that they are heading to one hell of a beating.